Seventh graders, welcome back from spring break 2020. Hopefully you're doing well. And here we go with the last home stretch of school. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, when we were getting ready for spring break, we had covered the Middle Ages dealing with the Magna Carta and how King John was forced by the nobles in 1215 to give up some of the king's power. The hard thing about studying world history and European history at this time period is there's just so much happening around the same time. All right, so the stuff we covered last week, while it might have been in the year 1215, that was when the Magna Carta. What were you guys doing in the Magna Carta year 1215? Black Abyss. Me too. But apparently the nobles were rising up against the British king. But the idea is that when we study world history and Western civilization, we have to understand that things happen about the same time. So when we say the Middle Ages and King John and the Magna Carta, about the same time, while all that was going on, other important things were happening in Europe and in the Middle East and around the world. So keep that in your brain as we kind of talk about some things this week that are happening around the same time as the Magna Carta. We also last week talked about some of the other things happening. It was a slow leak of the king's power, and the church still had a hold on pretty much everyone's lives, right, in Europe. There was only one church, one universal church. Our word for universal is Catholic, right? There's one Catholic church, and there's always that power struggle between the Pope and the kings of Europe. So I want you to think about this as this week as really the kings and the people of Europe really felt obligated. In fact, they believed that they needed to do what the Pope said to do, right? He was in control of their soul for eternity. So if the Pope asked them to do something, then most European Christians, right, who were part of the Catholic Church would rise up and do whatever he asked. One of the big things in history, maybe you've heard about it or played a video game, would be the Crusades. So I want you to think back to sixth grade where you covered Islam and you covered basically all the world religions. And you remember that for Islam, they too wanted control of what we would call Jerusalem or the Holy Land. That land for them was sacred and holy. It is sacred and holy for Jews. It is sacred and holy for Christians. But the battles that we're going to talk about, the wars between for the Holy Land, called the Crusades, were between the Christians and the Muslims for control of this area we would call, like today, Jerusalem. And it starts in the year 1095. And you'll notice that the Crusades, with an S, means that it's plural. There's more than one war for the Holy Land. So it's a series of wars between Christians and Muslims over who's going to control the Holy Land. When the Muslims take over, when Islam spreads and becomes prosperous in the Middle East and Northern Africa, they take over what we would call Jerusalem today. Well, if you're a Christian, the idea of that your holy city would be controlled by another faith was just too much for the Pope to handle. So the Pope called for the kings of Europe to send their best warriors to help defeat and drive Muslims out of the Holy Land. This series of wars would be super important in the history of the world. And we know from sixth grade, right, that even today, the Holy Land, the Middle East, is a very important place in terms of strategic location, but also in terms of religion. The three main religions of the world, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, all three call this Holy Land sacred. But this particular time period, and starting around the year 1095 and working up, and there's a series of these all the way up until almost the year 1300, are the Christians and Muslims fighting for control of the Holy Land. So if you look at this chart, this map, you can see the Holy Land on the right, where it says Jerusalem. And you'll notice that according to this chart, there are how many Crusades? Are you able to read the key? So there are 4 according to this chart. And remember, each crusade could last years because, it's going to take a long time to get armies mobilized and march that long distance and fight and then march home again. So these crusades were over hundreds of years. Sometimes Christians would win, sometimes the Muslims would win, and it would go back and forth, a tug of war, if you will, over who was going to control Jerusalem. And after all this hundreds of years have passed, the issue of who's going to settle and control this territory really is not answered. Neither side was satisfied. The Christians, in the end, will lose the territory, but for them, it's still a sacred place. And as history moves on, it will go again back and forth. But the effects of the Crusades are clear for us to see. We see an exchange of knowledge. So when soldiers or knights go to fight from, say, England or France or Germany or Italy, they bring with them knowledge to pass on to the people that they interact with, not necessarily fighting, but people along the way. And when there is interaction with, say, people of a different faith or different culture, they're able to exchange ideas and take that back with them to Europe and vice versa. It's the flow of information. And we also get better maps and the development of better compasses just because we're traveling and there's a lot of energy and brain power put into making better maps. Europeans got products they would have never seen, spices and sugars and lemons and silk. All of these things would be new to Europeans. Now remember, imagine a world where food is not refrigerated and you have pretty nasty food, spices like pepper that you would get from the Holy Land or from trading with people in the Holy Land would make your food taste a little bit better in an area, in a time when you couldn't put food in the refrigerator. There was no such thing as cold anything really unless it's wintertime. And everything would have been bland or nasty or slightly rotten. So spices made a big difference. And the idea that crusades are going to kind of begin this, they end what we would call feudalism. You remember we talked about how people were tied to the land and everything was about the land, manors, and that the nobles owned that, and all these serfs and peasants were tied to the land. Well, the nobles begin to lose power as a result of these crusades. And eventually the serfs will be freed. People won't be tied so much to the land. Not literally tied, right? But just they can't get away from that lifestyle. But now at the end of the Crusades, people start to kind of not do that so much. And even today, there's a lot of tension all between all 3 faiths, Christians, and Muslims and Jews over the Holy Land. Who's going to control it? If I were to turn on the news or watch some news websites, today Christians aren't so much involved in the fight. Today it would probably be Muslims and Jews fighting over the Holy Land. So the issue has never really gone away. It's still there of who's going to control this Holy Land. And when you get to high school, you'll learn more about, say, the end of World War II, when basically the world said, Jews need a nation after the Holocaust and all the things they went through. So that the winners of World War II basically said the Holy Land now belongs to the people of Israel. Jews get their land back. But for 1,000 years or so, there's this back and forth over the Holy Land. But this week I want us to focus on the Crusades and how that's going to affect the world. And I will put on Schoology a couple pages from the book that I have like a snapshot of. So if you don't have a book at home, you can read the pages that I post. If you do have a book at home, it's on page 562 and 563, or you can read the 2 pages that I posted. I'm also going to assign you the task of thinking about postcards this week. So I want you to think about 3 separate postcards that you'll be writing. Now, I don't want you to start working on them now. I just want you to think, like if you were part of the Crusades and you were a soldier or a knight from England and you were fighting for your Pope, what would it be like? What would you experience? So I want you to read the pages that I post. I want you to look over these notes a couple times. And then I want you to think over the next day or 2 about the Crusades and start thinking about if you had to write postcards. And the instructions would be on the assignment when I post that. But if you had to write a postcard, what would you include on things that you might have seen, some of the people you'd interact with, why you were fighting, when you were fighting, so the dates and all of that. But again, you can think on that a day or two. You can message me or email me if you have a question, and we're going to set up a Schoology conference for, let's say, Tuesday. So I can kind of give this information through a video chat and talk with you and connect with you, make sure you're good with it. So Tuesday, probably around like 2 o'clock, we'll set up our first conference this week. We'll try to do a couple conferences each week, probably 2 or 3 each week, so that we're sure we're like talking face to face, and we can I can answer any questions you might have. I think that's about it, gamers. Wash your hands, get plenty of sleep, and watch the slideshow again. And that's it. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll talk to you soon, and I'll see you at the conference on Schoology on Tuesday.